Okay, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to give a very, very quick overview of what is a really exciting and very, very complicated landscape. But it actually resonates with something much bigger, which is the entirety of the historic green landscape of the Sheaf catchment, the Sheaf Valley. And that runs to a significant degree from Clay Wood right in the city centre, all the way out to Totley and Gilfield Wood at the upper end of the Sheaf catchment. And I suspect the site that will be known to people is Ecclesall Woods, which was our long-term study location. But in actual fact, that is only just the tip of the iceberg. And it is something that we've looked at previously and had aspirations for an evaluation of this entire landscape on the basis of what I'm going to share with you very briefly this morning. I suspect that in terms of an historic landscape linked to the development, particularly of local industry, this would be on a par with Iron Bridge or somewhere of that nature. It is a hugely important, but I'm sad to say, a largely neglected heritage aspect of the city. So I want to explain some of this, that we've done a lot of work in the last few years with the Friends of Grace Park, South Yorkshire Biodiversity Research Group, Landscape Heritage Research Foundation, and support from the Heritage Lottery. We've failed to get the park designated by, I can never remember, English Heritage, Historic England. We still think it is worthy of designation and special recognition for the reasons that I will share with you. At the present time, they don't see it. Now, the picture in front of you there is actually where I gave up playing cricket as a little tiny, because I went to the local junior school and I couldn't understand why I couldn't hit the ball. And the reason was that the pitch was on a ridge and furrow system, and where the ball went was anybody's guess. But that dampened my interest in cricket. And I'm sure the Yorkshire County Cricket Club has suffered ever since. But you've got this fantastic landscape, really complex. People walk over it and they do not see it. They don't understand what's important. And the management, to a large extent, of these precious landscapes, not just here, but generically, regionally, and even nationally, does not take this sort of feature into account. So what we've got there is ridge and furrow. The park is full of ridge and furrow, which may be medieval open field, the open field from Norton Village. It may be Victorian steam plough. There's even some areas which are probably World War II dig for victory. That's where we are, now called Graves Park. And of course, Graves Park is the modern name for Norton Park. Norton Park was a major series of embarkations in North Derbyshire, but we refer to it as Graves Park because it was bought by Sheffield's great benefactor, the late Alderman J.G. Graves, and gifted to the city. Otherwise, of course, most of it would have been undoubtedly built on. So we're thankful to Graves for that bequest, as it were. We've had two Heritage Lottery projects. One a few years ago was called Norton, in the heart of Chantryland, because we're right in the heart of the area designated or described by Armitage at the turn of the last century. Well, when I say the last, I mean around about 1900, the heart of Chantryland. And we, through Armitage's book on Chantryland, we do have a really good insight into the landscape and the people, the great and the good, round about that period of the 1800s. Our second project with the Friends of Grace Park has been finding lost Norton Park. And this really developed from a twinkle in the eye, as it were. For me, I grew up here. I always thought it's a bit special. I always felt that we didn't really know a huge amount about it. And I wanted to try and discover Norton Park within Graves Park. And this goes back to long-standing interest, which I say was partly because I'm totally biased, as I know Patrick is with his site, because I grew up near here, and this is where I played as a kid. But in the 1980s, when I was city ecologist, I walked the area with Clive Hart, an archaeologist who may still be known to some of you. And it was that really drew my attention to the fact that he and I together were able to see things which other people had not apparently seen, or if they hadn't registered the interest. We can look at some of the archives and things like illustrations, this print, which shows the previous hall to the present one. And it shows the juxtaposition with Norton Church, which again itself is a very complicated building, but is probably in parts the oldest built structure in the region. It's had all sorts of additions and things stuck onto it. But we start to get a feel of this grand 1700s landscape and its context. Okay, so we've got to find the second of our projects, Finding Lost Norton Park, which is really the detail. The first project, I think, confirmed that there was something really exciting to look at. The second one, Finding Lost Norton Park, was drilling down in certain areas of the park to look at the heritage and see if what we thought was the case was really correct. And a lot of the ideas came from walkover surveys with archaeologist Clive Hart, who was also based at Western Park Museum back in the 1980s. And there we see a glimpse of what this landscape used to be like, the 18th century residence next to the ancient Norton parish church, all of course in North Derbyshire, not in Sheffield. And then a different angle of view there, so you get a different insight into the house. And we know that there are earlier, there must have been an earlier residence linked to the earlier park, and some of the footings, some of the foundations are still present in that landscape. So very, very exciting stuff. This is a basic layout of the present day parkland and just some of the features that have been identified as being of interest. And there we have the hall, the church, the grand landscape park and later Corporation Park. This is the area called the Deer Park. And then this is the old park. So bear that in mind. That's the Hemsworth Road. That's the Derbyshire Lane. That's the ancient Holloway running through the area. So I'll just go through some of the key take-home things from this. The work we've done so far confirms the amazing heritage of this landscape. It's a park landscape with ancient features from a series of medieval parks and an important picturesque landscape. And then through to the 1920s, a municipal recreation park. The woods in this well-wooded landscape, part of the Sheaf Valley grouping of ancient woodlands, they are in part ancient woodlands. In actual fact, the Natural England designation has missed out some bits which are ancient woodland, and it includes bits which clearly, from looking at the historic landscape, are not ancient woodland, but are down on the ancient woodland inventory. They're ancient bits of the park. But these were former working woods with charcoal burners and other traditional woodland industries. And we think we have some of the oldest remaining charcoal sites in the city. The antiquity of the woods in the park reflected in the rich flora of woodland and grassland. These, when you stop and look, are incredibly rich. And the Friends group have been fantastic in mapping out in great detail what we regard as indicator species of ancient woodlands. The landscape has got evidence of farming from medieval through to Victorian and then into 20th century, as I say, possibly wartime dig for victory. There are ancient features, suggested mounds and barrows, which are then incorporated later as roundels in the design park. A linear bank and ditch feature, which the archaeologists such as Ken Smith believe is prehistoric, but has then had multiple uses over the centuries as it's reused in the medieval park landscape. And the park boundaries themselves are still part intact and probably largely date from the 1600s to the 1800s. The group again have helped to map the boundary And also we've investigated the areas around, because when parts of the park are removed, the walls reappear in the contemporary walls of local houses and gardens. And we've even found archival evidence in newspapers saying where the developers were actually compelled to reuse the stone that they got from the park. The built structures are diverse, from farm and outbuildings at Bowl Hill, the name obviously being significant, from initial agricultural enclosure to subsequent improvements. There are park lodges from the early 1800s and later, 19th and 20th century kitchen garden and plant nursery walls and structures, to municipal park buildings from the 1930s onwards. At its heart is Norton Hall, its stable block and Norton Parish Church. Again, just highlighting the depth of interest in this landscape. There we have the roundel, which we think is a prehistoric burial site. And of course, you've got the medieval fish ponds here, and all sorts of other interesting aspects of this landscape. Bowl Hill, situated to the north, is an early industrial site, probably with a history of lead smelting, located just outside the park. Some of the built structures in the park are critically at risk. The Bowl Hill Barn, for example, is badly neglected with exposed roof timbers and broken walls. And it's been like that for several years. And the timbers are going to rot unless action is taken very soon, and unless vegetation is cleared from the walls, they're also going to be broken down. So you've got quite a significant building now, which is very, very problematic. However, there are enigmatic remains of lost buildings, the summer house, and there are oral history memories and images of some of these places. There's rich map-based evidence from the 18th century, pre-ordnance survey, and rich archival resource, identified, largely collated, but much more detail still to be discovered. And excitingly, we've also managed to gather local memories and memorabilia, but there's a lot more to do. Again, we get insight. This is the modern building in part. There's more being added to the side of it, the orangery and things like that. And here we've got an 1800s grand fete. We can look at the lidar. You can see there the fish ponds, the house and the buildings, etc., in this area here. So we can look at the lidar and start to glean much more information. That is the prehistoric boundary, which actually runs right the way through the medieval woodland. And that's the what we think is a barrow, and there's also evidence of at least one other robbed barrow in that area. So we can start to put in some of the context. This is an area that I've described as a miniature Dukeries. We've got Norton Park, which is the historic park, Sheeple Park. There's a series of enclosures over towards Chesterfield Road. It's now a miniature golf course. But we've got things like the Morgahay, and we've got the Oaks Park, which is Nouveau Riche and Parkation. But you've got this grouping in North Derbyshire of very significant landscapes. And again, just to give you a hint, we have a report, which I think I've sent the link for, which details this in much more detail. But we've actually gone through, we've mapped things like historic gate posts and gate stoops and the significant trees in certain places and the sunken routeway. And then we mapped things like ancient woodland indicators, wood anemone there, marking out very, very importantly the ancient areas of landscape. And the group also mapped out the distribution of bluebells, again marking out the historic landscape. And this is one of the few sites in Sheffield where we have genuine native wild daffodil. That's the mound, which has had various usages and ends up being a roundel in a designed landscape, but the archaeologists believe that it's actually a burial mound. Excitingly for me, because I thought this was an ancient landscape and very, very significant landscape, we've now tracked it back to a royal warrant around about 1257 AD. So far from being the 20th century park, which my city council colleagues used to believe it was, in the archive, we actually have that document. It's in a peculiar early English script, and it will need specialist work to actually decipher that. Some of it looks almost like Latin, but I'm assured it's actually a medieval script in English, obviously by an individual hand. So it takes an expert to actually decipher what that means. But that gets us back to the 1200s. This area is emparked, and there's a right to hunt game from the 1200s. And that refers to this area here, which is actually the old park. This is then the deer park, and then this whole area becomes a grand landscape park in the 1800s. And we have a map here, 1741, of the estate, and we've got names like Old Parks, and the present avenue and walkway is there, but there's a boundary running along there. We have Spring Park, that's next to the wood. Well, the wood was a spring wood, so the Spring Park is next to the coppice wood, which is here. This is the wood. And then here, in what is the deer park, the present day cafe is about there. You can see now we've got the row of planted trees, it's double avenue, and some of those trees are still there. And fantastic names, Holling Hill, and that's because in the deer park, the lord of the manor would feed the deer with holly, cut from the holling. So Holling Hill. And Hob Hill. So an Anglo-Saxon name for an area probably inhabited by ghosts or hobgoblins. So we get all sorts of insight. That's the prehistoric boundary, but then being reused in the 1700s, 1600s, 1700s as a boundary between two emparked areas, Upper Hare Hill and Nether Hare Hill, possibly linking to rabbit warrens. And again, in more detail there, Old Park, Spring Park, Holling Hill, Hob Hill. So really very, very interesting landscape. And when we look at the buildings which need more work, some of the old buildings, the stonework is incorporated into the churchyard wall at Norton Church. And you can actually go into the cellars underneath the present day, late 1700s, early 1800s building, and the original earlier cellars and structures still exist quite extensively under there. That needs more work. We've then got a 1775 map of the estate, and this shows the complex area to the south of the house. You see there, there's the church, the older house, the new house is rebuilt, probably around about here. Some of these trees on this avenue still remain. And here we've got evidence of the wall gardens, and it becomes a grand landscape and romantic landscape with a dingley dell and all sorts of things, and a walkway that people wrote about. People visited here and took in the dramatic views to the west. It was a famous picturesque landscape. You could see dramatic sunsets, and people would come here and walk in that parkland. Norton Hall from the deer park. This is one of the more familiar images for people. The deer may or may not have been there. You have to remember that these are all engravings, so there's a bit of artistic license. But there, the present day building, without the orangery and the other bits that have been added to it, and then the church in the distance. But park, fallow deer, giving a setting. And then the early 1900s, you can see the orangery and the other buildings have been added to it, and there's more to the back. They even had their own gas generating plant and a wonderful collection of old cars here on the front. You also notice how grubby the building now is, and again shown as this in the mid-1900s, when the whole lot became the annex for the Jessop's Hospital, the women's hospital. But you can see the smoke deposition, really grubby on that building, and a rather nice view of a garden roller as well. Now, this is one of the enigmatic features that I will leave you with. This is Summer House. It can be either one or two words. And what the archaeologists think, this is a photograph from the 1930s. We have oral histories from someone who is about 100 years old and actually at one point inhabited this building. We have photographs from the inside of the building out, with very few other views of the outside of the building. But that looks like an addition, and this looks like what we think may be a Tudor hunting tower. And it is visible from the hall, or the hall is visible from it, and this overlooks that early park. So that is really exciting, and that tree is still there. And the Rose Garden Cafe occurs to this side. So we can actually place this, and the footings are still here, and we would love to do a proper excavation of this. It looks like this was overseeing the old parks, and it fits the pattern of a Tudor hunting park lodge, and it gets demolished in the 1970s. We have oral histories of people remembering the bell being rung to tell you the park gates were about to close. So we had that in the 60s and 70s, and I think there are more memories to get, but this gets demolished. Unbelievable, really. The Friends group have been fantastic because they've really kind of bought into the whole history of this landscape. And what I've shown you is a landscape that we can show and evidence and document from prehistoric right the way through the medieval up to the present day. What it lacks in the present day landscape is a single guiding hand, a landscape designer. And that is why the government agencies have refused so far to designate it. Whereas my argument is that this actually encapsulates landscape change over a long period of time, and we have the evidence for it. They don't quite buy into that. They don't see it as a significant designed landscape, whereas I see it as landscape historian as a unique palimpsest, an overlaying from early times to the present time. So thank you for listening. Sorry about the hiccup at the start. That's our website, and there is a report, a very copious report produced with the Friends Group on that website, which is free to download. And there's more information on my blog as well. So thank you very much. That's the actual download there.